Dave, yesterday was a big day. It's a big anniversary for my wife and me. 1 year ago yesterday, she had open heart surgery. She had aneurysm in her aorta, and they repaired it. And so 1 year later, yesterday, she and I went and hiked up, climbed up the Manitou Incline down in Manitou Springs, Colorado. It's right outside of Colorado Springs, and it's a pretty big challenge. It's something like 2,700 steps going almost straight up. And when we were there, so you go up this incline. It's an old cog railroad they used to use, and all that's left are the railroad ties. And so
Right.
you hike up it. But then the trail down is this long zigzaggy path along. It's like 4 miles coming back down. And as we were walking down, we were just reminded of how friendly and helpful people can be when you get out into nature a little bit. And I've noticed this, I'm sure you've noticed this, any kind of outdoor activities, people who camp, hunt, fish, ride their ATVs around, things like that, where they're out in the boondocks, kind of away from everything, where it's not real easy to just call an ambulance or call a repairman or,
Sure.
if you need help, people kind of help each other. And it's sort of amazing when they're out there in the wilderness, camping, hiking, they tend to be really friendly to each other, very polite. They actually stop if someone is, stopped on a path, on a trail or something. Everyone who goes by stops and says, "Everything okay?" Just
Right.
checking on them. And it's an interesting thing. It's not merely that people become altruistic when they're out there. I mean, I think a lot of people genuinely care. If someone looks distressed or in trouble, they want to help. But there's also this self-interested piece. Everyone knows I might need some help.
Sure.
I might get hurt or need my car fixed or whatever out there. And if I ever need to ask people to help me, I want to make sure that they actually do help me. So it's in my interest to be polite and caring and helpful to other people. And as my wife and I were walking down, we were talking about this, because it's such a noticeable difference from the way people act in the city, where they often won't even make eye contact with you, right?
Right. Well, and for you guys in particular, knowing that going in, you had a sense of this. You've spent enough time. We live in Colorado. We spend time outdoors. We live in a lot of these scenarios.
Yeah.
You're doing something extremely physically challenging a year after open heart surgery.
Yeah.
There is some comfort in knowing that you can count on your fellow human beings to be good people, even if it's for altruistic purposes, which we've admitted, we've talked about quite a bit. Things like profit aren't a bad thing, right? Even if it's for altruistic reasons, this understanding that you are not going to have to worry if your wife were to have a problem on that trail, there is likely somebody else who's going to be able to come along and help you.
Right.
There's some comfort in that.
Absolutely. And what it reminds, so by the way, I have to give a big shout out to my wife. It's a pretty incredible thing to go from
it absolutely is.
open heart surgery to
I will openly admit, my entire life I've been in Colorado. I've never done the Manitou Incline, nor do I have any interest in doing the Manitou Incline.
For the record, my wife post open heart surgery is more of a badass than you are, Dave.
And for the mere fact that she was willing to do it, let alone did it,
and did it, made it all the way up and all the way down.
I have no interest in even trying.
Well, and what was funny is, so you see all these smiling faces and everyone's checking on each other. I mean, it really is a thing of beauty. And I've seen this before, when I'm out camping or riding ATVs around. And it brought to my mind, I mean, what you have out there when you see people, camping, hiking, it's a community that is entirely voluntary. If there's any interaction that goes on, any kind of exchanges, it has to be voluntary, because there are no regulators out there. There's no bureaucrats saying you must do this or must act that way. It's all voluntary. And it reminds me of this great tradition we used to have in this country, in the United States. Well, in fact, in North America, I'm going from the time prior to the New Deal, so pre-1930s, all the way back through the 19th century, back through the American Revolution into colonial times. What you find here in North America is, first of all, this was a continent being populated with incredibly productive people. And this is true going all the way back before the Revolution. One of the reasons the British Empire wanted to tax these colonies, the 13 in North America in particular, after they had finished a big, expensive war with the French, is because these colonies were so productive. They were creating so much wealth, they knew they could tax a lot. And so that meant people in North America were in a position where they could help others. They could help friends, neighbors, family members who needed help. And we had this tradition that stretched for more than 2 centuries, up until the 1930s, of one of the most beautiful and efficient and productive forms of personal assistance, individual assistance. And there were just a few basic features to it. And it was not designed. There was no central planning commission it just happened spontaneously. It happened naturally. One of the features was assistance tended to be local.
Right.
Meaning people in a neighborhood or in a town. And why that mattered is because people in a community who know each other, they know those who are genuinely in need. You know, the family whose house just got struck by lightning and burned down. That's a family they don't have a place to sleep tonight. They really need some help. Versus the bums,
right?
the people who are just lazy and don't want to work.
Well, it's the dichotomy that we've been talking about for the last few weeks.
Yeah,
you have 2 choices in life. You either live and be productive, or you do nothing and you die.
That's right.
That is the simple dichotomy. And when you're making that localized choice of whether you want to help somebody, you can make it based on, is this person trying to live? Mm-hmm. Is this person actually want my help and want to be productive and live? Or are they just a bum, like you said, and they don't really have any interest in being productive? Yep. They don't have an interest to live.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
They just want to die.
And all these wonderful features flow from assistance being local, and the people who gave tended to know the people who received the help, and vice versa. And so, just think of what happens there when there is help, there's assistance, and the people know each other. The person who's giving the help, first of all, they feel good. They just helped a friend, a family member, somebody they care about. That's a good feeling to help. You see someone you care about in pain, in a bad way, and you can help them out. That's a great feeling for the person who gives. Mm-hmm. It's also in your self-interest. You want to help others because you never know when the day will come when your house is the one that burns down or gets blown away in a tornado, or somebody gets sick in your family, or you need some help somehow. And then on the end, the person who receives the help. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine in our world today of centralized welfare, when assistance was personal that way. Those who received the help, first of all, they appreciated it because they knew they were not entitled to any of it. They were going and asking friends and will you please help me? I'm not entitled, but I really need help in this pinch. They were appreciative. It often came with a sense of obligation, a sense of debt, right? The person who received the help wanted to give back, if at all possible, or at a minimum, work his way up so that he could be in a position in the future where he could turn around and help somebody in need. The other interesting feature about traditional American assistance, and I mean personal assistance, going to individuals in need, is that Americans tended to discriminate, and I mean that in the classic traditional sense of that word, that to discriminate between able-bodied and disabled-bodied. If someone, and these aren't many people, but if there was a person who was truly disabled, couldn't walk, couldn't move around, people would help that person. And there weren't a whole lot of them. But if someone was able-bodied and needed help, very often communities would have some kind of poorhouse. Sometimes it would just be it'd be a little area in a barn. Other times it would be an actual standalone building, but it usually wasn't very pleasant.
Right. Nobody
Nobody wanted to stay in the poorhouse. And if you ended up in the poorhouse, there was a requirement of work. If you were able-bodied, it was okay. We in this community, we're not going to let people starve or freeze on the street.
Right.
You'll have a place to sleep, and there'll be food, It's not going to be the Ritz-Carlton. It's not going to be the most comfortable place, and you're going to work. And think of the incentives that creates, right? If you're in this unpleasant, temporary place and you're working every day to live there,
Yep.
It's natural, right? If people in that situation think, well, heck, if I got to work every day anyway, I might as well be a little more productive so that I can go buy my own house or rent my own apartment or have a nicer place to live.
Well, and think about that poorhouse in a lot of circumstances. And it wasn't just the poorhouse. It was when you were an apprentice back in the colonial era, you were living in somebody else's home. You were apprenticing for them. You were working for them. And instead of paying you or compensating you with money, they were compensating you with a place to live, food, meals, those types of things.
Yeah.
If you wanted more than that, you had to figure out a way to be more productive than an apprentice to that person. And I go back to, and we have the book right here, my favorite story, the autobiography from Ben Franklin, which he went through that. But as you were talking about sort of those dichotomies of what it is to have local personal assistance versus what we'll eventually get into and talking about national assistance and what that looks like, the actual first thing that came to mind wasn't an economic assistance issue. It was that first trip that he took into Pennsylvania. And
you're talking about Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, yes,
So I
absolutely.
believe he was about 17 years old, and he takes a boat from New Jersey down to Philadelphia, right? And at that time, a boat ride from New Jersey to Philadelphia wasn't an hour or two. It wasn't a 4-hour train ride. It took some time to get down there.
Right.
You got to know the people you were on the boat with. And in the book, he talks about how that boat, as it's pulling up to the dock, capsized. The boat capsized. And most of the people on the boat had no idea how to swim. And Ben Franklin made the choice among the people he knew to provide them assistance. He was swimming out like a lifeguard, swimming out, taking people, swimming them back to shore, going back out. He didn't have to do that. He was risking his own life.
Yeah.
And he could have just as easily said, I learned how to swim, you didn't. That's not my problem. But instead, he went back and forth and back and forth. You talk about people wanting to improve themselves after that. He talks about in his autobiography that people started coming to him after, the same people who was on the boat. Can we pay you to teach us how to swim? They wanted to improve that aspect of their life. It had nothing to do with their economic situation. It had nothing, but there was no expectation that if the boat capsizes, there's going to be lifeboats and there's going to be a Coast Guard and there's going to be all of these people there to help me. I don't need to know any of this. They understood right at the beginning, I'm taking a risk by getting on this boat. And they were lucky enough to have made a friend in Ben Franklin who happened to know how to swim.
That's absolutely true. And that was, what we see today when we go out camping and you see people just out there in nature on their own, helping each other, looking out for each other. That was basically the United States for a long, long period of time prior to the New Deal. And, that has enormous repercussions for things like citizenship. Now, it wasn't a formal thing, right? When one neighbor was asking for help from another neighbor, no one was getting a lecture on citizenship. No one, right? There was no discourse on what it means to be a good citizen.
Well, that's just because you and I weren't their
well,
neighbors.
That's true. We would have offered that discourse. But it happened spontaneous. It happened naturally, right? Everyone knew that the only way they could help the people they loved was to be productive. And as they were being productive, they were becoming more self-reliant themselves. They knew when they were in a pinch, something bad happened, an illness in the family, a natural disaster like a fire or tornado or flood, they knew that they were entitled to precisely zero. They were entitled to nothing. And if someone offered some help, they were thankful, they were grateful, they appreciated it. Now, sort of contrast what happened with that kind of personal local assistance where everyone knows each other, they know who the truly needy are, and they say of the able-bodied, you got to work. You want some help, you got to work if you're going to get help. Contrast that system with what gets created in the 1930s that we have to this day, which is taking personal assistance. First of all, putting it into the hands of the government. That in itself is a big transition. The early United States, those local acts of assistance and help, most often didn't include government at all.
Right.
And when it did, it was the local, it was the city, it was the township that would maybe, help fund a poorhouse or something like that. So it was usually no government involvement. The rare times it was government, it was local government.
Right.
Now imagine taking this whole realm of personal help, putting it into the hands not just of the government, but the federal government, right? And then centralizing it far away, where bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. are now going to sit and try to figure out what kind of help do people need in communities across the country, people they've never seen, they don't know. And the help they offer arrives in the form of a check or just a direct electronic deposit into their bank account. It's anonymous. Even if someone today who gets some kind of personal assistance, suppose they wanted to pay back. Suppose that they were really appreciative. They say, I was collecting government assistance for so many months or years, and now I want to pay back. To whom would they pay? And the answer is nobody knows.
Right.
It's impossible to know. And so there's no sense of appreciation or gratefulness, just the opposite. When those checks those electronic deposits start arriving regularly, very quickly many people start to expect it. And then that actually fuels an attitude of entitlement, that they're entitled to it. And many times it actually leads into an entire lifestyle. People start to learn how to game the system and which forms to fill out, which ways to increase, the assistance checks that they're getting. They teach their kids how to do this, and it becomes a lifestyle in a way that was impossible. That was impossible under the old form of personal assistance we used to have.
Think about that during these last few months of COVID, right? When the government was changing unemployment benefits, it wasn't just citizens figuring out how to game the system. It was employers figuring out how to tell their employees, I'm going to furlough you instead of fire you, or I'm going to do this instead of that, or I'm going to knock you down to this many hours so that you can go get federal assistance. There was no interest in making good choices and people deciding, okay, who needs this and who really needs the assistance, who doesn't. And then on top of that, when you do have I'm trying to remember how far back. It was one of our earliest podcasts. We talked about this idea that the centralized government has no way of knowing what every single person needs. Right? So they do everything in uniform.
Yep.
And the person who lives in rural Iowa is getting the same check that the person in downtown Manhattan or Los Angeles is getting. Mm-hmm. And that check doesn't do much good of anything for the person in Manhattan or Los Angeles, but the person in Iowa, I don't have to work for the rest of the month.
Right.
You just covered all my bills for the month. I'm good. I'm gonna go lay on the tractor and hang out.
Right. And so, again, this influences so many aspects of our civic life, and it changes completely how we understand citizenship, how we understand ourselves as citizens. We have today, we've been talking about the New Deal quite a bit. We have this great Toolbox series. We should remind all of our members and subscribers that we have this Toolbox series of videos on the New Deal, and they're short little 7, 8, 9-minute videos, and it tells that whole story of not just what the New Deal is, but really how it transformed government in the United States. It transformed culture. It transformed how citizens view their government and view each other. And so what we did in the course of the 1930s and 40s and then the decades after is we created a government and government programs that now actively, aggressively disincentivize good citizenship. Mm-hmm. Incentivize, our government today, our programs today, incentivize irresponsibility, incentivize deception, as you were just taught, right? Businesses and organizations advising their employees or their partners how to put down false information on forms so that they can get a little bit more assistance or qualify for this or that program. Whereas the old natural, spontaneous form of assistance that was voluntary, that was local, that was personal, it helped make people better. It helped make them be better citizens. And it also just helped them be better human beings because it was a way of uniting their own self-interest with the interests of others. Everyone, when you don't have a big sprawling welfare state, when that doesn't exist, all you have are your neighbors and your friends and your family.
Right.
And you never know when you're going to need some help. That's a pretty powerful incentive, right? There are exceptions, but in general, sort of being on your own with the people around you is a pretty big incentive to be nice to other people,
right?
To treat them well, right? It encourages good behavior. It doesn't guarantee it, but it encourages it.
But it also encourages one of our four key virtues of being a good citizen, being a good person, and that's self-reliance.
Yeah.
Don't ask for too much. When you ask for too much, you start to become a nuisance and people want to stop helping you. When you're not trying yourself to improve, when you don't, if that boat keeps capsizing and you refuse to learn how to swim and you just keep waiting for Ben Franklin to swim out and get you, eventually he's going to say no. And I think it's really important that everybody understands that this isn't just economic, right?
That's right.
Assistance happens in all kinds of ways. And as we were talking about this, one of the things that actually just came to my mind was I'm thinking about the role of police and sheriffs in colonial times versus today. That was a very local position,
Very
right?
much, yes.
If you lived in a small town, especially in Colorado in the 1870s, you probably knew who your local town sheriff was.
Oh, absolutely.
You knew them personally.
And he knew you.
And he knew you.
Yeah.
And he was willing to take on that role and assist you when you were in trouble.
Yep.
And you appreciated that. And there was an appreciation for that role.
In fact, and let's be clear, that sheriff also knew that all or most of the citizens in his community were also willing and able to take care of themselves to a large extent, including in the realm of self-defense.
Right.
They were armed to the teeth. They were not going to let anybody come and mess with their property, their family. And so what that meant was what the citizens expected from the sheriff was pretty low.
Sure.
It was pretty, because most people were fairly self-governing. They took care of themselves. They were self-reliant. When you have a truly free society and you have people who are being productive and they're self-reliant, they're largely independent, and when they need help, they turn to each other. In that kind of scenario, you know what people expect from their government? Not much. Very little. That's how you have a limited constitutional government. When you have a nation of people who say, hey, you feds, you in the federal government, make sure that no foreign armies or navies come and invade us and kill us. And other than that, there's not much for you to do in the federal government. It's when citizens stop being productive, stop being so self-reliant and independent, stop helping each other, and they all turn to the federal government with their hands like this, saying, we want you to help us. Now, all of a sudden, you can't really have a limited constitutional government when you have a nation of citizens who feel entitled, who demand help and assistance personally from they want their government to supervise, subsidize, and regulate every aspect of their lives.
They don't want to have civic knowledge. They don't want to have to go out and learn anything. We have to figure out these roads, but I know we need better infrastructure, but you deal with it. It's not my problem. You go deal with it. You're the elected leader, as Wilson would have said.
Boy,
right?
and that's a decisive point for our freedom-loving members of the Vino Veritas Society to understand the conflict between knowledge and an attitude. When you have large numbers, I mean millions, many millions of Americans who have an attitude of entitlement. They expect their government to deliver things that they want or need. Maybe they say they need, but they really just want it. They say they need an iPhone. Right. When the truth is that they want an iPhone. They don't really need an iPhone. And they want a federal program to subsidize an iPhone for them. When you have large numbers of people with that attitude. And then we freedom lovers show up and we offer some civic knowledge. We say, wait a minute, that's unconstitutional. Let me explain what the Constitution says and why the Constitution grants no power to government to create this program or that program.
That's when they want to throw out the Constitution.
That's right. That's right. The civic knowledge on its own doesn't compete very well with that attitude of entitlement, which is why what we're ultimately about here is not merely talking about information and data. I mean, though we do that, but it's really about changing the attitude of citizens so that citizens want to be good citizens again, so that they want to be self-restrained, self-assertive, self-reliant citizens who understand the few legitimate purposes and powers of their own government.
And going back to the sheriff, the local sheriff example that I was talking about, when you want to think about the Old West, I think about a movie like Tombstone, right? Where there's a line and it's,
I'll be your huckleberry?
Well,
not that one.
That might be the best line in the movie. But there's a line where I think it was Virgil, one of Wyatt Earp's brothers, talked about his duty, right? That they knew how to be law enforcement. That was what they knew. That's how they could be most productive. And so he says, this is our duty. We owe it to the people of this town. We've made money off of these people, and they come to our bars and our saloons and our casinos, and we've made money off of these people, and we owe it to them. We have a sense of duty to them to protect them. And that was local, because they did. They knew the people, and the people knew them. Now transition to today, and the visceral hatred among certain parts of the population for the police.
Yeah.
But who do they blame? They don't blame their local sheriff who got elected, right? They elected their local county sheriff.
In fact, many of them don't know who their local county sheriff is. Yeah.
They don't blame their mayor who appointed the city, the chief of police. They blame the federal government. They blame the president. The president is in charge of law and order, and therefore it's got to be the president's fault that this is all happening. Right? This is Donald Trump's fault that we have bad police officers.
Yep.
And it's because there is no more personal connection anymore. There's no more those police officers don't get a chance to get to know the members of their community, and the members of the community take no time to get to know the members of their police force.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that creation of the New Deal in the 1930s and 40s went a long distance. It wasn't the only thing that happened, but it went a long distance in centralizing power, centralizing resources, centralizing at least perceived legitimacy in Washington, D.C., which means, and in that sense, it kind of is a zero-sum game. If the more Washington, D.C. is viewed as the foundation of power and resources and help and assistance,
the source of assistance,
then the less local community, local government is viewed. In that sense, it really is kind of a zero-sum. People don't tend to say, yes, I rely on my neighbors and friends and family and the local government and the federal government for everything. They tend to look at one, and we've been gradually moving in this direction of Washington, D.C. as the place we turn to for every kind of help that we might possibly need.
I think the summary of all of this, it goes back to what this key mission of all of this is, and what we hope people start to realize is we need to, as a group, we need to become more self-governing, rely less on the national assistance, the federal assistance. Get involved in your friends' and neighbors' lives. Be willing to help. Hope that they will be willing to do the same and have those conversations with you.
And that's a key point to emphasize. If we're successful as an organization, if the Vino Veritas Society can help large numbers of Americans become better citizens, this isn't just about politics. It's not just about civic life. Better citizens also means we're better people.
Right.
We're nicer to each other, right? We're kinder. We're more thoughtful. We care more. A good citizen cares about the people around him.
Right.
A good citizen doesn't say, "That's your problems aren't any of my concern. Go sign up for some federal program. That's not a good citizen. A good citizen says, how can I help you? And tries to help their neighbor.
And then at the same time, and this goes back to your comment about the iPhone, right? The good citizen understands the difference between want and need. They know how much to ask for. They know when it's appropriate to ask their neighbor or their friend or their family for help. And they know when they need to say, you know what, I need to figure out a way to be productive to earn this. I need to save money. I mean, you talk about how society has changed before the New Deal and after the New Deal. People don't save today like they saved years ago. We feel the need for things, so we just go buy them on credit, or we ask somebody to do it, or we go lobby the government to create some...
Even for things that aren't needs.
Right.
They're really wants.
Right.
So I want that iPhone.
So enough people lobbied Barack Obama to say, we all need iPhones.
Right.
So therefore, he created a program that people on food stamps also got iPhones.
Well, this is a great illustration, and I hope our listeners just imagine this kind of shift in personality, in attitude, in character, when assistance was local and personal and voluntary. Now, I know they didn't have iPhones in the 1830s, but imagine the equivalent of an iPhone then, whatever that was. When people were turning to their friends and their neighbors for help, nobody would have gone and said, I need you to subsidize an iPhone for me. They wouldn't have. They wouldn't have asked anything from their neighbor unless they were in dire straits, some really bad situation that they couldn't help, and then they would go and please help me out of this. And it was as temporary as possible. It was the bare minimum, whatever the person in need needed to just survive and get through that rough spot in time. When assistance becomes, first of all, it's put in the hands of government. It is centralized in Washington, D.C. It becomes anonymous. Now, all of a sudden, it becomes really easy. It becomes really tempting for citizens to turn to the entity that's assisting them, the federal government, rather than neighbors and friends, the federal government, and lobby them for subsidies for an iPhone.
Well, and over time you become used to that, right? You no longer think of this as, wow, we got really lucky. I really wanted an iPhone. I got pretty lucky. I don't want to have to keep going back and asking for more.
Right.
I want to figure out how I be more productive. I want to do more.
That's if assistance was voluntary and personal.
If assistance was voluntary, and even when it's not, when it was rare, right? When it was rare, even if it's not voluntary, even if it's not personal, if it's rare, it's appreciated. When it becomes commonplace, the appreciation goes away completely. And,
that's right.
And I think back to movies about the Great Depression where you can feel the characters. You can tell these characters, they didn't like going and waiting in bread lines.
Right.
They didn't like, I hear friends talk about their family's experience in the USSR before it collapsed, waiting in bread lines, what they would eat at night just to have enough. And
you know what lines are even longer than the bread lines? The lines at the liquor stores.
Wow.
They were Soviet liquor stores are famously just out of everything, and so there'd be these huge lines waiting for the next shipment of booze.
Which is probably why during this COVID era we deemed liquor stores essential.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But there was always this feeling of, I don't like that I have to do this.
Yes.
I don't like that I have to do this, and I'm going to do it this time because my family needs to be fed, but I'm going to figure out a way so I don't have to keep doing this.
In fact, I'm going to throw out something here. Some people might find a little controversial, and that's okay because my purpose here is to provoke some thought. What you're describing is an old form of assistance that brought with it a little shame. It's a little shame. And I'm going to suggest that was not a terrible thing, that in some ways that might have actually been a good thing. It's there. The help is there. You're not going to starve or freeze. It's a little shameful. It's a little embarrassing. And that embarrassment, first of all, the safety net was there, so you're not going to go die. But the embarrassment was a powerful, shame can be a really powerful human motivator. That's a big incentive to get out of that situation, to be productive and get out of that state of dependency as quickly as possible. I can remember the movement in the 1980s and the 1990s when the federal government, they used to have these forms of welfare that were these big certificates of paper. And it was obvious. If you're standing in line at the grocery store, everyone could see. They knew who the welfare recipient was. And so they started instead issuing these debit cards that looked just like a regular credit card to remove the shame. And, I think if I had been sitting in that conference room as there were conversations among bureaucrats, right, how to make this transition happen, I would have raised that question. Well, wait a minute. Do we really want to remove all embarrassment and all shame from this form of anonymous, centralized federal assistance? That shame and that embarrassment can be kind of a useful thing.
Well, and now it's been flipped on its head. Now, not only are we trying to get rid of shame, they're shaming people for being critical of people who are able but unwilling. Right? We talked about able-bodied and disabled. Right. Those who are able-bodied, who are capable of work, but would rather just sit on their couch. Right. Last podcast we used to say it was the choice was binary,
death or productivity.
Right. And now there's this third option of live off of welfare and be unproductive but survive. And you might not survive great, but you game the system well enough, and there's enough freebies that you get your iPhone.
And by the way, let's be clear. That third option applies not only for individuals but also for organizations and businesses now. Right.
Sure.
You can be a business, and it's no longer, I have to be profitable and provide value for people or go out of business. Now there's this third option, or maybe I can get a contract or a subsidy from the government, in which case I don't have to beat my competitors. I just have to keep lobbying the politicians who send subsidies and contracts to my business.
And if I do a bad job, I can tell them, it wasn't because I'm not a good contractor.
Right.
It's because you didn't pay me enough, so I couldn't use good enough materials.
Right.
It's the issue of the tax exempt world, right? It's the issue of, hey, it's the bureaucratic world, right? That's been our longtime critique of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy just sits there and says, well, we're going to do some things today, and we're going to find some ways to take control of your life, but it's not going to have the desired effect because it never does, right? The dominoes never fall the way bureaucrats say they're going to. You create a Jobs Act, and all of a sudden unemployment goes up 5%.
Right.
But when you do that, the result is the bureaucrat says, well, it's not. Look, I tried to create a Jobs Act. I was doing something good. You just didn't give me enough money to go execute.
That's absolutely right, and you know that points to another important related topic here. So the way you and I have been discussing this, we've sort of ignored one of the most common popular progressive criticisms of the way we've been speaking. Whenever a conservative of any type, a constitutionalist, a free marketeer, a freedom person will criticize federal assistance programs, whether it's individual welfare or subsidies for businesses or paying farmers not to farm or whatever. The government subsidizes all kinds of things today. Whenever someone criticizes those programs, the first progressive reaction is to say, well, then you don't care.
It's the new
right. You don't care if you just challenge that federal government program sends money to single mothers and to poor people and to elderly people. If you criticize the program, therefore, ergo, you don't care about women and you don't care about poor people and you don't care about elderly people. Right. And I want to make it real clear what we're talking about here. We're not talking about not caring, just the opposite. We're saying we actually care. We want the single mother, the poor people, the elderly, the people who are in genuine need. Something bad happened in their life and they need help. We want them to actually get help. And the best way to supply that is a system of personal assistance that's voluntary, that's local, that's personal. Once you centralize it,
Right.
you know who gets paid first?
The bureaucrat.
The bureaucrat gets paid for it.
And
not
usually
the person,
more.
Not the person in need.
Right.
The bureaucrat first gets paid, and maybe some kind of assistance ends up in the pocket of the person who needs it, and maybe it doesn't. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the bureaucrats that get hired to manage and administer the programs. They're the ones who get paid first. I don't want money going into the pockets of government bureaucrats. I would rather see people handing money to their friends and their neighbors who genuinely need help.
It's hard to argue that's not a mafia. I mean, truthfully, right? Please, Don, may I open my business? Will you provide protection to my business? And you can take the first 70 cents on every dollar I make.
Right.
Right. I mean,
And the Don, the bureaucrat, right, is sitting there. He's getting paid regularly. Money's going into his pocket, and he sits back and scratches his chin and wonders, well, do I let this chap open a business or not? You and I just had lunch at a kind of famous Denver establishment, a little diner right there on Colfax, and the owner owned it's two buildings. It's a diner right next to a nightclub. Mm-hmm. And the owner owns those two buildings and the whole parking lot in between, the space in between.
It's his land.
It's his land. All of it's his. They even share kitchens. And with COVID going on right now, they have put up a few tables and chairs, and they have these little umbrellas to shield you from the sun. All this just happened within the last few weeks. And we learned from some of the staff there, they've been wanting to put up some little tables and chairs outside for over a decade. And they haven't been able to. You know why? Because the mafia dons, otherwise known as the city regulators, wouldn't give them a permit, wouldn't give them whatever license that they needed to do that. And even what they have now, it's very temporary. It's going to expire soon. And so the owner has to go lobby, has to go beg. Maybe we'll try, that's what incentivizes corruption right there. Because if you're a business owner and you need this permit, and there's the bureaucrat sitting there scratching his chin, but boy, it's really tempting to just slide some money across the table and say, look, I'll pay you off the record. We had just signed the damn permit so that I can go run my business the way that I want to run it.
Well, and if you think about it, the analogy goes even further. It's okay, you just gave the Don or the bureaucrat 70 cents on every dollar you made. And then 3 weeks later, that same bureaucrat decides, you know what? I don't think I want to provide you your protection anymore. I think it's going to be 75 cents on every dollar.
Right.
What choice do you have? Right. You're already in. You've just invested everything you have into building this restaurant. You're only making 30 cents on the dollar after all your taxes, and I think I'm going to squeeze you for a little bit more.
Yep.
I think I'm going to squeeze you for a little bit more, and it goes on. And we've been talking here about assistance, right? And that assistance is only it should be local and voluntary, and that's how we're talking about a lot of these things and the bureaucrats. But let's not pretend that taxes aren't the same thing, right? When you look at taxes, how many times have you heard somebody make the argument, well, if we didn't have such high taxes, we wouldn't have any roads.
Right.
Do you think Walmart, do you think these companies, that Safeway, Kroger, any of these stores, do you think any of them would say, okay, we're good with no roads? Nobody actually has to get to our store. We'll figure it out. The food doesn't have to get to us. We don't have to worry about that.
Right.
Who cares about roads? It's this dichotomy. It's the new binary choice. You either pay a bunch in taxes to have government do it, or it doesn't happen at all.
Well, and let's be real clear here. Where people truly value something, I mean, they want it. They're willing to trade for it. It will happen no matter what it is, whether we're talking about roads or we're talking about cars or computers or houses, or where people truly demand something, someone else will supply it, will help provide it. What government really excels at is taking people's money and then providing services and programs that people don't value. And the way we know they don't value it is it wouldn't exist if it wasn't for government doing it. I think of things like public broadcasting, right, on radio and TV is a great example. Progressives love to say, well, that's really important that we have that programming. So that's why we need taxes and government. And I was saying, well, if it's so important, if it's so valuable, why doesn't it just exist, operate as a business? And the reason it doesn't is because hardly anybody values it. Nobody values it. Nobody wants to actually pay to have that thing exist.
And the one or two shows that actually exist on there that people do watch, imagine how much better those shows would be if one of the main stations said, all of a sudden public broadcasting doesn't exist anymore. We really want that show Sesame Street or whatever it is, right? Saturday morning on CBS, early in the morning, I want to show Sesame Street.
Yeah.
We're going to go buy it. We're going to go pay the producers. Forget this government funded. You're going to do just enough to get funded by us.
One of the most famous skits in the history of Saturday Night Live is a skit with Alec Baldwin.
Right.
And this is probably 2 decades ago or more. And the skit is an NPR radio production, and you it's like you're seeing in the studio. He's the guest, and two of the female comedians, right, are supposed to be the NPR hosts, and his last name is Schweddy, and he has these he's made these Christmas balls, so they're talking about the Schweddy balls.
Yes, I remember this.
Anyway, the whole skit, what makes it funny is their dull, monotone, boring demeanor on the radio, which is how many of those shows are, because they're not competing. They're getting subsidized by tax dollars. They don't have to compete for listening. It doesn't matter if they have 0 listeners. They're still going to get paid anyway. That's what happens with government programs.
Right. So let's summarize because we talked a lot of stories and we went on a lot of tangents here, but the big takeaway, the biggest takeaway is when things are local and voluntary, they're between two people who know each other.
Yeah.
The value is higher.
The value is higher. It incentivizes good citizenship.
It is still an exchange between two people. For the last several weeks, we've been talking about capitalism versus cronyism and progressivism and the New Deal and all of these things. And we've said at the end of the day, capitalism is moral because capitalism is a mutual choice between two people.
And let's be clear. If you and I are neighbors and I have a little store, I run it out of my living room, and I have something for sale that you need, and you walk in and you agree to pay me and I sell you, right? We trade dollars for the product I'm selling. We'd call that capitalism. We'd call that free market freedom. If we're neighbors and your house burns down and you walk over and you say, Tom, I need some help. My house burned down and I say, hey, Dave, come stay with me until you get your place fixed back up. That's still a trade. It's an exchange. I'm trading. There's some help I'm offering to you, and in exchange for that is your friendship. I mean, that's part of capitalism. That's part of a free market. That's part of freedom. I also know, right? I'm kind of storing up some chits by offering my help to you after your house burned down. I might need help down the road, and I'm thinking, you're going to remember that I helped you. So when I need help, you're going to be more willing to help. Those are free people interacting with each other, trading, exchanging voluntarily. That is there's a kind of beauty. There's a kind of loving care in that kind of mutual voluntary interaction that you not only cannot replicate it in a distant centralized government program, that distant centralized government program undermines all that good that's in those personal interactions.
How would I even know, or why would I make the decision to voluntarily engage in something if I didn't know who was benefiting and how they were benefiting and why they needed that, the assistance?
So where people are free, where they help each other, well, let's just back that up. Where they are free, they tend to help each other, which tends to make them better people, and it tends to make them better citizens.
Right.
And the less they help each other and interact with each other freely, voluntarily, locally, the more that government takes control and centralizes all of that. They become worse people. They're ruder to each other. They are more likely to ignore and neglect each other even when in need. And they become worse citizens.
Right. they miss the virtues of being a good citizen. Those are the virtues of the American idea. Those are the virtues that we are trying to guard. Those are what make us the guardians. It's why we say no sumus custodes.
And that's how we'll wrap up today. No sumos custodes.
Till next week.
Yep.